Everybody's super mad at this big retcon, this huge retcon, where now women can be custodies. It's the biggest retcon. It's actually crazy that Games Workshop would dare change the sacred text. They dare change the book, the sacred book. But at the end of the day, this isn't the first time that Games Workshop have adjusted the law to make it fit what they need to do, to make their thing widely appealing, to get more customers, to make more money. They are a publicly traded company, and whilst I'm shouting and saying adding someone with she, her pronouns as a custodian is really cool, sadly, ultimately, we all have to accept that really it is just to make money. That is like the long and short of it. Changing the story as we go on is how Warhammer was wrote. There was a tweet yesterday by, I think it was Nick Davis, his name. He worked for the studio, and he basically said that Warhammer was always left open, untrustworthy sources reading the lore and stuff like that. And the whole point of it was to be able to adapt, to change, to be added to add models, because ultimately the lore, the sacred text everyone's shouting about, all it is there for is to sell stuff to you. You read a cool story. Okay, cool, you enjoyed the story. I enjoy the stories too. That's totally fine. But the whole point of it is you read the cool stories, so then you buy a model about it. Whilst overall, the Horus Heresy series, especially the Siege of Terror series, is just a masterclass in storytelling, the underlying reason that Games Workshop is putting money into those sorts of novels, sell you stuff. When you become a public company, you have quarters, and you have to make profit every quarter, and the next quarter, and the next quarter, and you have to keep pumping out more and more profit. You can't go, I made £10 this quarter, I'm going to make £10 next quarter. No, the shareholders expect you to make 11 or 12 or even 20. And this is not the first time they've adapted or changed the law to sell you stuff. And, thankfully, to our good friends at Wargamer, here are 8 Warhammer 40K retcons that are bigger than Female Custodes. The first one of the big retcons in recent history, the Warhammer 40K timeline was rolled back 100 years for 9th edition. When Warhammer 40K 8th edition launched in 2017, the big battle between the Ultramarines and the Death Guard, that was the whole point of the launch. There was books called The Dark Imperium about the Plague Wars between the Ultramarines and the Death Guard. It skipped over 100 years of history all the way to the end of the Indomitus Crusade, when the Primaris were first introduced. They've already been introduced. Here's 100 years later. When 9th edition was launched, the timeline was rolled back. New codexes and novels are set in the first decades of their crusade. So what they did was introduce this law. Primaris are here. Then they went, Primaris have been around for 100 years, actually. They're all fighting battles and doing their things, you know. They skipped loads of it. And then at the start of 9th edition, they rolled it back and said, oh yeah, they've been around for like 20, 30 years. Okay. This had a direct impact on Guy Haley's Warhammer 40K book, The Plague Wars, to a point where Games Workshop recalled the first 2 novels. They republished the 2 books to make the 3rd one fit, because it was launched in 9th edition, because they didn't want the lore to be talking about 100 years in the future. When they retconned all of the lore and went back 100 years, they republished the sacred books with different dates and different stories. That is a huge retcon. That is one of the biggest retcons that Games Workshop has ever done. They literally recalled Black Library novels. I don't think that's ever happened where they've gone in and changed the lore so quickly. It was like within 3 years. That's like never happened before. Did people get mad? Of course they did. Of course they did. People were mad about this. Were they angry on Twitter? Were they selling their armies? Were they raging in the daily rag? No, they weren't. People were just a bit pissed. And you know what? I can agree. That's a bit annoying if you read a book and then they recall it and change it. So now your book is out of date. It's almost like Games Workshop like publishing books and then making them out of date within 3 years. It's very normal. They got the lore players to do it as well. But ultimately, that is a huge retcon. That is massive. And it didn't have anywhere near as any outrage as Female Custodes. Also, the Primarchs used to be just Space Marines. They weren't better than Space Marines. They were just Space Marines, as Tim goes off to say. When the Space Marine Primarchs were first mentioned, they were just the leaders of a Space Marine chapter, not the sons of the Emperor. A teeny tiny Lehman Russ miniature was even produced for the first edition Warhammer 40K, holding the leashes of 2 very small wolves. They're just the captains of the chapter, you know. They were the leaders of the chapter, but they were just another Space Marine that had earned the rank. Weren't really anything more than a Space Marine. Like, a Space Marine was still genetically modified, etc. Don't get me wrong. But a Primarch was just the main one, the best one of them. Also, Space Marines were just humans. Aside from their unique Space Marine armor, the Space Marines were simply human soldiers. They were a very elite soldiers, sure, but the special Space Marines organs that make them into transhuman badasses weren't part of their lore until midway through first edition. Accordingly, they only had the toughness 3 for the game's first edition. Not the toughness 4 that everybody has. You know? Not Orcs were retconned! The designers at GW only settled on the ideas that orcs are bad at shooting and good at fighting during Warhammer 40K 3rd edition. Before that, they had very similar stats to Imperial Guard and were mostly differentiated by all the wacky weapons they had access to. The idea that we have 40K we have now is so different to when it was first written, and the only way that we were able to do that was to retcon it. They aren't the sacred texts. They're just the things to sell you stuff. Go woke, get bad aim. The orcs can't shoot anymore because of the woke. Because of the woke agenda. Because of the ESG and the DEI. Ruined my orcs. The orcs are once slaves of the snotlings. Since the first orc supplements, orc law is referred to a lost race called the Brain Boys, which was responsible for orc technology and perhaps even their genetics. Modern lore points to this being the old ones who created the Croc during the war against the Catan and the Necrons during the War in Heaven, but the War in Heaven was made up during 3rd edition 40k. Before that, who were the Brain Boys? But the Brain Boys were tiny, idiotic greenskins called Snotlings. Early orc lore in the books like War, Da Orcs, and Here We Go states that rare fungus gave the Snotlings the intellect needed to rule orc society and take it into the stars. Unfortunately for them, this temporary advantage in brains didn't help overcome the orcs' advantage in brawn, who ultimately ended up on top of the heap and brainifying fungus died out. I can't believe they retconned orcs 2 times. I'm selling all my Warhammer because they retconned orcs 2 times. They retconned Space Marine twice. They retconned orcs twice. They retconned Custodes 1 time, kinda. Not really a retcon, it was an expansion. Necrons had no personalities. Now this one, near and dear to my heart, because guess what? I used to play Necrons, and I started playing them just as they went from their 3rd edition book, which is filled with pariahs. People crying out for pariahs all the time, even though we have Lich Guard, which is basically the same thing. But pariahs, I wish they would come back. You remember those models that got written out of the lore because you wanted to stop selling them? I do, because Necrons used to have no personalities. Necron models were introduced late in 2nd edition 40k and then fleshed out with the Codex and lore midway through 3rd edition. In that version of the Necrons' backstory, they never defeated the Catan, and when they awoke in the 41st millennium, they were mindless puppets. This didn't change until 5th edition. While the concept of full-powered Catan wandering around in 40k is cool, it would mean we miss out on excellent characters like Tracing the Infinite, Nemesis Andrek, and the great books like The Infinite Divine and Twice Dead King. They changed the whole lore where the Deceiver tricked the Necrons, saying they're going to make them immortal. Chat, this is lore I know about, okay? They tricked the Necrons into becoming mindless puppets, and then they realized they fought the Catan, they fought the Deceiver, and turned them into shards, which is why they stopped being the Deceiver and Nightbringer. They became Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, Catan Shard of the Deceiver, because they are mere Pokeballs now. They literally go Catan Shard for the Necrons, because the Necrons beat them and enslaved the Catan Shards, shattering them at like a minuscule, still very powerful, become transcendent, closer to what you'd expect from the Tomb Kings. They are unleashed to the battlefield, and then they stopped being mindless because they beat the people who try to make them. I joke that I don't know the lore, but I know a hell of a lot of it. Canoptek spiders fixing the vault as the Catan, but we didn't have that until 5th edition, because the Catan were just big things that tricked everybody and became the masters and enslaved Necrons. Bloody woke Necrons! They literally made them asleep. Slaves. And they made them woke. Emotions. They were asleep and now they woke. Leagues of Votan aren't base dwarves. Squats were an old base dwarf faction. Dwarves on motorbikes and trains, okay? Tyranids ate them all. The entire squat race was deleted from the game. And then they were slowly introduced back into Necromunda. The squats have been there all along. That's a retcon as well. And then they reintroduced them in Necromunda as literal squat. But Leagues of Votann aren't really squats. They are kind of like a new faction. Lost race of humans on high gravity planets that made them short, essentially. Loads of lore jargon to make them space dwarves. The Leagues of Votann are a modern reinterpretation of the squats, a faction of space dwarves introduced in the 1st edition 40k and given rules but no new models in 2nd edition. They were absent from 3rd edition and generally considered to be wiped out by the Tyranids. But they weren't gone forever. The 6th edition rulebook makes a minor mention of Homo sapiens rotunda still existing. A new squat bounty hunter was released in 2018, followed by a full Leagues of Votann Warhammer 40k faction in 2022. The Leagues have now always been around in the background Warhammer 40k, even teaching the Tau Empire how to make its trademark rail rifles. We just never saw them. They literally shoehorned in a brand new faction. Why? To sell the faction. Anyway, where were we? There was no Horus Heresy. When Warhammer 40k launched in 1987, the Emperor of Mankind was already consigned to the Golden Throne for life support, but it wasn't Horus Lupercal put him there. He was just incredibly old and tired from all his psychic shenanigans. When GW published at 1988's Adeptus Titanicus, it could only afford to make one mold of vehicles. To explain why both forces were fighting with the exact same Warhammer Titans, GW invented the Horus Heresy Civil War. They just retcon the Emperor now? The Emperor's woke now? That year, Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness fleshed out the timeline of the Horus Heresy in greater detail. There are a lot of differences between those 3.5 pages of lore and the version of the Horus Heresy book series. The lore of 40k isn't written by a single author, but a myriad of creators balancing their ideas against the needs of a company that turns a profit both from inventing and selling new plastic doodads, such as every model, in its distinctive IP to various other businesses such as games, audiobooks, books, mobile games, and toys, right? Because those creators are clever and interesting, the results usually are too, but it will only stop changing when 40k is dead. If you're curious why some people have particularly strong reactions to lore changes, Wargamers visiting psychiatrist Dr. Joe Stamager has an article explaining some psychological factors that make gamers unhappy with change. Interesting. There's also some particularly vitriolic responses to the news about female custodes as a symptom of a larger phenomenon. Editor Alex Evans dives into that more detail in this article, broad question of female space marines, which is what we read on the stream before. Ultimately, if you want to say female custodians is a retcon, then everything is a retcon. And if everything's a retcon, it's probably not that big of a deal. You aren't protecting anything. You aren't holding up the bastion. You aren't holding a gate. You're just being a bit of an idiot. And it's okay. Things will progress. Personalities change. Interests change. Ideas change. Everything changes, okay? And just because some lore is changing, some stories changing, maybe you just don't enjoy it anymore. And that's probably okay.